trying to put together town budgets overall, it's going to be itemizing where and poor choice of words, but where the biggest fires are going to be. How do you handle those? Do you have things that are stable, that there are times that we look at budgets, as we're in our finance committee crunch meetings, where you can look at the last 3 years and it's within $200-300 of each other. It's fairly stable town department that we can wrap our arms around. It's where is going to be Department X suddenly has a $500,000 need that maybe because of either equipment, something happened in the building, just things that would come up that you've got to fit in there, not necessarily as an operating perspective, but how are you going to account for this one way or the other? I think in relation to the operating budget, it's easy to say, we'll cut this, we'll cut that, we'll cut this. My thought would be, look at the revenue side first. Where are opportunities? Who are we not talking to? I think in relation to the school committee, I think that there was a good amount of revenue that was dropped because of grants that were expiring, weren't being picked back up. Where's the ability to fill those holes? Are there other grants, things of that nature? I'm not saying that that didn't happen, but where we have the time from a meeting like this, where can we find other sources of revenue so we're not all pointing fingers saying, you need to cut your department, no, you need to cut your department. If we find other sources of revenue, then everybody's happy.
Okay, so I'm going to hit you with the first question. What would you like to see the school committee change that could help you facilitate the budgetary process with us, seeing as we're one of your biggest?
Well, yeah, I mean, look, Jim, I think we passed a $24 million budget, of which in round figures, schools in overall represented about 33% of that budget. And this is where you get into, did this department get another staff and I had to lay off? At the end of the day, it's the biggest number in the budget that I'm looking at. What I would look at its earliest possible state is, where are we going to be in student population? Solely and selfishly from Hanson, I'm looking at that 60-40 split. How is that going to impact me? Now, that doesn't help Frank and everybody in Whitman, but if that were 2 years from now to be 35-65, that has a much bigger impact to Whitman than it does to me.
I'm not going to speak for Frank, but I can see him chomping at the bit a little bit. Frank, for 5 years, has said to us he'd like to see a rolling average so that wouldn't affect each town, and especially the town of Whitman. Frank, you want to discuss that a little bit?
Well, obviously, the division of the assessment is a big factor for Whitman and has been for a number of years because it keeps growing. Contrary to all the planning we did in the 90s that said that wasn't going to happen. And I'm not sure at this point we know where that's going to be. I think the bigger picture is our ability to identify our resources, your needs, and then put them together to figure out how to meet them. About a month ago, maybe a little less than a month ago, I did some estimates on FY18 relating to revenue, relating to actually calculating out increases in property values, new growth, and all the other things that go into calculating what the levy limit is. And I gave that to our assessor and asked her to validate it. Unfortunately, we're still waiting for information related to property values to determine how close we are on those estimates. But I believe it's a predictable number, which I don't think anybody in this room believes is growing at any appreciable rate. We know that we're going to have to rely more on what the towns are able to produce. So what I would like to see from the schools as earlier estimates. I know how we do things. You wait for Chapter 70 money and you look at the programs and the parameters. But I think we have to start planning ahead a little sooner, making more predictions, recognizing that they're not going to be etched in stone. They're not going to be an actual budget for FY19. But in 3 weeks, we're going to be in FY18, so we have to start thinking about FY19. What I would like to see is some gross estimates from the towns and from the schools somewhere in August or September to identify what we're looking to see. And I know it's going to be a big number. It is every year. But we have to start focusing now on what we need next year if we have any chance of finding a way to make that work.
Okay,
Okay.
Fred?
And I think there's two things that we need to identify as well, because we always run into the issue, level service versus expanding services. And by expanding services, there are so many things that we really and truly, or at least myself, feel that we need to be doing, that we should be doing, that we haven't been, and how we can accomplish that.
Well, we should be addressing those arguments in September and October, not in February and March. By then, the train's already pulled out of the station. So the reason I asked that we start earlier is to come up with some supportable estimates based on our experience, based on our history, and based on our anticipation. And then identify those, start working together collectively as a group to figure out how the school and the towns are going to come together to meet that.
Okay,
Can I ask a question of both towns?
Sure.
Because I constantly hear the school and the towns. In 2008, when the school laid off many, many teachers, more than the declining enrollment, and cut programs, more than the declining enrollment, how many firefighters and police officers did Whitman lay off?
We had the same 25 fighters we had in 1955,
I understand.
and
but
we had the
lost-
same
we
26
lost
cops
school
we've had
employees.
since the 80s.
But the only department that lost employees was the schools. And all I keep hearing is the schools and the towns, the schools and the towns. Every other town around us has figured out they need more revenue, right? That's the elephant in the room. You need more revenue. In the absence of more revenue, the other departments have essentially kept level service while the schools haven't. And at some point, that's got to give. You can't keep falling further and further down that path, right? We're seventh from the bottom. We're actually worse than seventh from the bottom because other towns have done things in the last year. And at some point, we as citizens need to decide what kind of town we want to live in. I mean, it's plain and simple.
Well, the answer, Chris, is we have to find a way to come up with the revenue. Because we're not going to cut fire. We're not going to have people waiting for an ambulance for 13 minutes because someone shifts on. Because you might as well write them off at that point. You're not going to cut police with everything that's going on. And when you talk about big departments, there were 3 departments that deliver a huge portion of the essential services. The schools, police, and the fire department, and to a considerable degree, the public works department. The rest of us are overhead. We know that. But without that overhead, nothing else gets done. So we're really having a difficult time identifying, there's a curve. We go up, we go down, we hire people, we let people go, because we try to provide a system that meets the needs of the kids. And there are years where we've had growth in employment and years where it's declined. Very different in the towns. They haven't grown. There's no room to decline because during the times that weren't so lean, we weren't adding to staff. I have the same staff in the building department that we had in when did we appoint Bruce? 1982? An inspector and a part-time clerk. Now we have a 31-hour clerk.
I guess what I'm saying is
So
that at
what-
some point, you need to make the decision that education is a fundamental part of your operating budget. And if there needs to be cuts to that operating budget, then all essential services need to share on that, because education is an essential service. And I think we've lost sight of that. And at some point, the residents are gonna need to be faced with, if I don't come out and I don't vote and I don't increase revenue, then I'm gonna lose a police officer, or I'm gonna lose a firefighter, or I'm gonna lose an ambulance service. I mean, at some point, you can't keep taking it out on the kids. It's really easy to do that, and I think we've done that for a long time.
Go ahead,
Yeah,
Kevin.
practically speaking, Chris, are you suggesting something like, there's an override number here, if it doesn't get passed, there's cuts across the board,
Practically
rather than
speaking.
having a school contingent override?
Practically speaking, yes, right?
So-
No longer talking about the schools in the town because it's a shared problem, and I think that's a message that we need to
All
change.
right.
It's a shared problem, and that's the message that needs to get out there.
All right, that's a fair question. So how close do we think the towns are to thinking in terms of a town-initiated override process that begins sometime this year? And maybe it's too early to ask that, but that's sort of how this conversation started, right? Which was, there was concern on the Whitman side at the last meeting that the money we got this past year was maybe unsustainable, given that where the money came from. So it's
Why we need that information early.
That's why we're
In
doing
order
it.
to identify and substantiate and validate to the people that are going to make the decision that these are real needs.
That's exactly, I think, why we're here. Dan?
For Chris, you know, in 2008, the reason we're in such a hole is the state, under our regional agreement with the state, we were at, what, 86, 87%?
Oh, we were probably in the 70s.
70s?
Yeah.
But they took a big chunk away, and between the both towns took no action to try to fill that big void. When you take the biggest department and you lose a big chunk of change, we don't backfill that over the 10-year period. We sit in a big hole now. And the state has even told us, until we get our revenue up, we're not going to receive help for anything. This is where we kind of stand now, and that's why we're saying all departments have to take, you know, a hit like what Kevin was suggesting, you know, you got to put it out there as, here it is, folks. You know, we have to, as both towns, work together, get this fixed, or we're just going to keep going down, 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 because there's no revenue. We're running off, like you said, grants. That scares me that we're running off grants. Grants don't last forever. When they disappear, there's another big chunk of the budget gone. We do a real good job. I think Ruth and her team does a real good job at searching for these things and finding them and coming up with ways of using them. We're going to run out of a bunch of them in the next few years, and that's going to kill us.
Because directly or indirectly, every town department benefited from the fact that we received so much state aid. Because we didn't face this revenue issue earlier, because we were getting a huge chunk of dollars.
Should have been looked at 10 years ago.
some point, if the towns are unwilling to increase that revenue, then every department needs to feel the fact that the state has said, we're not paying anymore. I mean, it's part of it.
Well, let's not dwell too long on history, because I can bring you back to when Carl Kowalski was chairman of the school committee and had to appear before the finance committee to justify the school budget, and everybody got cut. Everybody got cut. We regionalized because we saw an opportunity to take a failing system and bring it up to par. And we made out well. We made out tremendously well. Unfortunately, the carrot they dangled
Was
has
removed.
been eaten. It's
Was
gone.
taken.
It started at 70%, and it's 50 now. And
Big chunk.
at the same time, revenues in the other departments were declining as well, but not as dramatically, which is what put us in this kind of us and them mentality. We need to get away from that. We need to look at what it's gonna cost to run the system, the whole system. The assessors, the collectors, the clerk, and the schools, all as one entity, and then figure out how we're gonna fund that. But we have to know what those numbers are first.
But
That's-
another easy way to do that is to take a look at the towns around us and see what percent goes to education, and what percent goes to public safety, and what percent goes to DBW. And I can tell you from the calculations, we're a little bit out of kilter.
We're not as far off as you may think, because the towns don't run Chapter 70 through their budgets.
I get it, I know it. I have a dad who spent 15 years on the school committee.
My
right? And a
calculation was
finance committee.
65% of our revenue. We add in Chapter 70, 65% of our revenue goes to the schools. So that doesn't solve the problem. We need more.
Well, it's not really, again, I don't want to see us pointing fingers at each other. I see this as a repair type thing, like, let's get the ball rolling, let's harmonize and work together. I understand what you're saying, Chris, I totally understand. And I understand that looking at other towns, but we have to fix our problem. I don't care what goes on in Rockland, I don't care what goes on in East Bridgewater. I do care what goes on at Whitman-Hanson, and we have to deal with that.
Yeah, it's been 10 years.
Josh or Jim?
So I like the idea of what you're saying, and I understand and respect what everybody has said here. But I do agree that we need to start coming up with maybe ideas to think outside the box. So in talking about grants, I understand that there's a lot of work with that, and I know you guys do a good job on it. I kind of mentioned this before. I'm just going to throw it out there, and we can shoot it down or whatever. What about hiring a professional grant writer? Somebody, you know what I'm saying, Ruth? Somebody that could, or even a couple people who could focus on what's out there and go after everything, because I'm sure as good as you guys are, you've got your other tasks to do as well, right? And I'm not certain, I don't know how much time you're able to put into it, but maybe, and by the way, I've heard Blue Hill do this as well, and you can actually pay them from what they get.
In some places, what they've done is they pay a grant writer who gets paid for being successful in getting grants. However, grants are called soft money. And they're called soft money because they're going to be here for a period of time and then they're gone. So in terms of sustainability, that's a concern. Perfect example is the Behavioral Health Initiative grant that Whitman-Hanson has right now. It was done through North River Collaborative, and that's one of the proactive things we do here. We are really good at fostering partnerships that bring in grants that we would never qualify for, which is another answer to your question, because we don't have the demographics. We might feel we're needy right now, but compared to poverty in this nation, we're not even close. So what happens is this grant was fabulous. 3 years brought us part-time social workers, wonderful opportunities for professional development, but the grant ends on June 30th.
Oh, I agree.
But with a level service budget, we can't sustain it. So we had 3 good years of social workers helping us in the school system, and we tried to get that into the budget, but a level service budget can't support that. The problem with grants is that they're expecting you, when the grant's over, to be able to keep up with the program. And so you still are going to have that same responsibility. Grants can be very helpful. They're better if you're buying things rather than people. And that's when I think we've had the most successful grants. I think it helps. Our demographics are not particularly interesting to grant funders. We're very middle of the road. What has happened since probably No Child Left Behind, which was the reauthorization of federal legislation for schools, was that districts like ours became less successful at getting grants. So if you look at what's happened since the early 2000s till the present, you'll see that our grant revenue has continued to go down, that in order to get a grant, we have to partner with a school district that has socioeconomic issues of poverty or a variety of things like that. So certainly it's helped. We probably have, Christine, how much in grants right now?
Close to $3 million.
$4 million, yeah. In the past, we've had more. Certainly it's helped, it's enhanced programs. I don't think it's the answer, but
No.
it could certainly help.
I'm not saying the answer, but
Yeah,
it just
but it
it
could
seems
help.
it seems practical to me to be able to hire somebody who's basically working for themselves and getting you.
Yeah, I think a
the
corporate
income.
sponsor's even better.
Yeah, no, I
Do
agree.
something.
I
But I
agree.
mean, there are corporations that will help fund
Donate,
school districts.
yes.
The problem with grants is if you can't sustain it, it's hard to do that. But certainly, it's been an important revenue source for us. And you can have grant writers who actually pay their own way by writing successful grants.
But
It's another source of revenue.
it is,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, well, again, thank you, everyone, for inviting me to participate in the conversation. On behalf of Rep. Deal, David's here from Rep. Deal, and Senator Brady. We're all different parties, different views, different towns, but we try hard to work together to advocate for our towns, and I think we do it as best as we can. I just wanted to say a couple things. Number one, you're not alone. Every town is facing these kinds of challenges, so I know it's common to think, woe is us. Everyone else has it better, but we're all in the same boat, and we're all facing the same challenges. All three of the towns I represent are having the same sorts of issues. I think because our community does have a higher percentage of its budget from the state, that it's perhaps more acute here. 1% shift here and there in state money can have a much bigger impact than, say, it does in another town that I represent. So that's an issue. At the state level, we're having the same sort of issues with revenues. You've probably seen the news. Our revenues are not meeting their benchmarks. Every year we get the so-called brightest minds in the state economy to come together and give us a prediction for what revenues will be for the next fiscal year. And this year they did so, and our benchmarks are coming in 2.5% below what they predicted. So it's causing us to come and have to make these same sort of difficult choices. We're looking at new revenues, things like an Airbnb tax. There's a new marijuana law that's going to go into effect. We're going to actually revisit that this week. We may actually seek an increase in that tax. Longer term, in 2018, there's probably going to be a ballot question on the ballot in the fall, having to do with what's called the Fair Share Amendment, having to do with increasing, putting a surtax on the state income tax, which I'm sure we'll have a robust discussion about. So the state is looking at different ways to try to bring in revenues. And so, over the near term, I would say the next, 3 to 5 years, absent some major change or perhaps the passage of the Fair Share Amendment, I don't see any major change in Chapter 70 or any major change in local aid. It's going up, 1 to 2% a year, give or take. Because our enrollment is pretty flat here, in some cases it's declining, we just don't see the increases in Chapter 70 that we see. But again, 200 plus school districts across Massachusetts got the same per pupil increase that Whitman-Hanson got. This year, $35 per pupil, last year $55, year before $25. It bounces around in that range. Every year we work hard to try to get it as high as we can, and some years we're successful. But again, at the bottom line, that's maybe giving you $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 more. It's not a game changer. It's not going to solve the problems here. So I wish I could tell you that, hey, just hang on tight and it's going to ride it out in a couple of years, we'll be past this, but I don't think that's the case. I think we're kind of in an environment where we're going to see very modest increases in state aid for the near term, and I wouldn't want you to rely on anything rosier than that, unfortunately. I wish I could be the guy that came in and just said everything's great, but it is what it is. So I'm happy to continue the conversation, but I just want to kind of throw those points out and thank everybody for kind of inviting me to participate.
Thank you. Ally, do you have a question?
I do. This is about generating revenue and how both of the towns can generate more revenue to help out not just the school, but all departments. And we can't cut from fire, we can't cut from police, they are essential. But what are the towns doing to increase their revenue? We can't generate our own revenue, but the towns can. What are you guys doing to, what is the word I'm looking for? Attract new businesses, new growth to the towns. I see nothing but residential homes going up and not enough business, and that is a bigger revenue generator than an individual home. That is going to bring more kids into our school district, which is going to cost us more.
From a practical standpoint, the only way to generate that revenue is to move Whitman-Hanson to a highway. Because until we have highway access, we're not going to have commercial development. We're too far off the road to attract large businesses. We do okay with small businesses. We have a thriving downtown center. We do have other businesses coming into town. Bob, thank you for opening that shop.
I just got the tax bill, wait a minute.
But by and large, our ability to raise revenue is limited to taxes and fees. We don't have the demographics that work for trying to bring big companies in. And God knows it's not for fun. I have talked to a number of different companies, manufacturers, supermarkets. It just doesn't work.
What is the opportunity for charging the busing to parents and residents that need a bus? I know it's
That's,
Not mandated to go.
Ruth, you know what the district regulations are, but within, we're required to transport a certain number of students to a certain area, certain distance from the schools. Within the, what we call the non-mandated busing area, we can certainly charge parents for that busing. But it becomes a regressive decision, because right now, I think we see a large number of families with two working parents, and they depend on that transportation to get children to school and back home. And when we start charging for that, all it's doing is moving the money from one pocket to another. It is hitting those people who probably need the assisted transportation more than other decisions may do. But that's a voted decision. If the town chooses to charge for non-mandated busing, well, then that revenue is available for appropriation and would be in the schools, because right now it's a line item budget in the school budget. It's a greater issue to Whitman than it is to Hanson.
I have a question about that.
Go ahead.
Because we do have a lot of, my daughter's going into the high school in the fall, but there are a lot of parents that drive their children to the elementary schools, and a lot of our buses are relatively empty, morning and afternoon. Both my kids from middle school and elementary school, we drove them every morning, only because they didn't want to sit on the bus for however long, or my son was crazy and always wanted to be at school a half an hour, 45 minutes early in the morning. We need to take a look at the busing and who's actually putting their kids on the bus and who's not, because there are a lot of non-mandated busing people that get allotted a bus, if you will. They're put on a bus, but they're not using it. So why are we spending all this money on empty school buses?
That's a great point.
Well, I think what you have are people who qualify for mandated busing who choose to travel instead.
What about the opposite of that? Do we charge students for parking?
No. And we
mean, if they-
definitely looked at that in the past,
We
haven't
looked
we?
at it.
The amount of revenue that's going to generate
Is
isn't
insignificant?
it's insignificant.
Okay.
And we did look at that, remember? It wasn't popular.
What were you,
To answer the busing thing, Ally, a few years ago, when Craig, I believe, on one of Craig Finley's last years,
for the year?
we have a program that eliminated like 4 or 5 buses. But we are required to have so many buses if they don't get a ride to school. You can't just eliminate it.
But what about
we've looked at that.
redoing the bus routes?
We do that constantly.
No, I know you do,
Yeah.
but like maybe like a survey or something to parents, is your child gonna take the bus?
come on.
I mean, I know that's very cumbersome and who wants
And I
to
don't,
take
it
that,
just
but-
can't, unfortunately, Ally, it can't work that way. Diane Naughton could give you in-depth the way that it works, but we use a computer program called VersaTrans that maximizes the number of students that can be on any bus. So we run the least number of buses we can, given what the parameters are that we must provide for transportation. So if there was any way to reduce any of the buses that we use, believe me, we would do it, because it's
So it's
very,
because
very
it's
expensive.
mandated and we have to bus them even though they're empty because their parents are choosing
Well,
to
often-
drive
Because
them.
if they didn't want to, all of a sudden, then you have to have
Right,
the bus
then we
in.
And what will happen at the high schools where you're more likely to see the empty buses, you're more likely to see it in the afternoon, and you're more likely to see it after juniors get their driver's licenses. And so we'll have people say, what is that district doing running the buses? Well, the bottom line is when school started in the fall, those students didn't have their licenses. And in addition to that, we're required by state law to provide transportation, Frank brought that up, for any student who lives 2 miles or more from the school, and we're reimbursed for any student who lives more than 1.5 miles. So if we want that reimbursement, which believe me is important money, we're going to do it, yeah, right.
Right, which is the question to the state, and it's been brought up now for a few years, and it was, well, we would have to look at the regional agreements, and we'd have to reopen them, but if we're not getting funded by the state versus if we could charge like the other towns around us, what's that net difference, right? Would we pick up more of the cost? would we be able to plan our routes more accordingly and potentially save some money there? And then, if the state's not gonna reimburse us, why haven't we opened that law back up?
Well, we are reimbursed, so I think it's important to say that we're reimbursed,
A
and,
percentage.
but not 100%. At this
But
point, it's
not
what,
with-
about 65%?
Yeah, 65 to
65%, that's important revenue.
Right.
So if you give that up,
Well, that's
I
what I'm
mean-
saying, what's the difference, right?
Yeah.
Is it meaningful? I think, because we hear all the time, well, why can't we just do something about busing? Well,
That's legislative.
is it, well, but is it worth pursuing that? Should we be banging down the door to Josh and to Jeff, or not? Me sitting here, I don't know, is the 65% better than if we could charge like other towns do?
Well, if we didn't have the financial responsibility, if we were not required to bus, we could just not bus at all. The Hanover High School doesn't bus anyone, as far as I understand. And,
They don't.
no, I think that's true. And my nieces went to the Reading Public Schools, and they don't bus anyone at all. So they never even had any snow days, because they didn't have to worry about it.
Randolph doesn't bus either.
So there are options, but it's legislative for regionals.
Marshall?
I want to jump on, Frank mentioned how if we did take away the mandated busing, it would affect a lot of families that possibly need that busing. We could look at some kind of like an income-based waiver system where some of those families that do need that busing could, we could waive, as the town, we could waive the fee for that. I feel it's what, it's 200,000 about for the non-mandated busing?
Four.
340.
Four for
It's
Whitman.
a significant amount of money that we should at least look at.
Fred?
And as far as the mandated busing and not being fully funded,
Reimbursed, yeah.
I'm an advocate that we should be suing the state. The way the law reads, and it's open interpretation, but the town or the district should be, shall be reimbursed, subject to appropriation. Now, what is the definition of appropriation? Okay, that's,
Spending the money elsewhere.
in the very fact that the legislature is looking to change the language, tells me that
It's just a loophole.
they
It's,
feel.
no, you're absolutely right, Fred. It's the same language, unfortunately. It's in other line items too. Sped, we don't always hit 100% of that. I mean, there's plenty of areas in the budget where you're supposed to fund or reimburse at 100%, and it doesn't happen. So I wouldn't encourage you to sue the state, but, that may be something that the, are we being recorded, by the way?
I'm 110% serious.
This is something to take up, there's a
Strong
regional
advocate
school, district, statewide organization,
Hard.
something that, would be good to take up at a regional issue level, because
Mass
other,
Association of Regional School
Exactly.
Committees.
Yeah. They-
And it's been mentioned very recently by me in an email.
right. And so, like this year in the House budget, we're in line for 631,000, and the Senate budget's 619, so it's a little bit of a difference. That is separate from the statute that says you have to mandate busing, so there's sort of, one is a budgetary issue, one is a statutory issue. If the town, in their wisdom, were to instruct our legislators that we want you to seek a change in this, then, we would do that, but it's separate from the budget, it's through the legislative process.
Bob?
Yeah, we went around the table talking about budgets, how to raise revenue, earlier estimates and needs, but I think what I need to see is what are the needs? In other words, what does the town of Hanson need? What does the town of Whitman need? What does the school department need? And then work the budget around that. I mean, we can sit here and talk forever about how we're gonna raise revenue, what do we need, but I think we need something that's tangible, and we can work in that area and say, the school needs X, all right, this is gonna cost this amount of money, Hanson needs this, Whitman needs that, this is the money we need, this is concrete, how do we arrive at the money? That's the way I look at it. When we established this committee several years ago, the school committee, that's what I was looking for back then. That was probably 4 or 5 years ago, to see what does each town need, and then work together to try and reach that. So I'm just kind of looking probably at a broader picture. But to me, we could talk about finances, but unless we know what we're looking for, what we need, we could just be talking about how to raise money.
I thought we did, I thought Frank summed that up, didn't you, by saying estimates from
Right.
Whitman-Hanson and the school by August, September.
I understand
That'd be
that,
the
but
first
what-
to do thing
Right, but
on
in
what's
other words,
needed.
what is the actual need? Do you need fire truck? Do you need DPW trucks? Do we need
Yeah.
full-day kindergarten? Do we need more foreign languages?
Mm-hmm.
Hanson, what does Hanson, I mean, more of a tangible. I understand what Frank said, but I need to see something in front of me. So that way you can, maybe it'd be easier to figure out revenue-wise.
Fred?
I think our strategic plan, if we follow that as a roadmap,
Exactly. I mean, in having asked that question now, after having developed a number of budgets with our plan, I think it would not be difficult for us to do that in August and September, to be able to say, this is what we think level service will be for 19, and these are the other things that are top priorities of our leadership team. Tomorrow, we're actually working on looking at the action plans for this year, how we did with them, and then we'll be projecting for next year. So I think it's something we can do.
But we also need the
Absolutely.
town side, Frank. That was one of the
That's
reasons
it.
we were getting this meeting together, was to see everybody's needs and be able to tell the voters. Someone mentioned earlier about voters. You know, instead of going in it in a piecemeal effect, say, this is what you expect from your town. Is this what you want these great towns of Whitman and Hanson to have? And this is what it's going to be, the figure. And what are we going to sacrifice and what are we going to bring on board? I think that's more what I wanted to see, too.
And I agree, we could come to a number, it won't be perfect, but at least it'll be very close,
It'll be
hopefully,
a
right?
target, and it won't be done 3 weeks before town meeting.
Yeah.
Because that's always the problem. We're scrambling for town meeting, everybody's scrambling at the very last minute. And that's one of the reasons we talked about getting everybody together, so we're coming in with a plan way before.
And Beth?
Beth?
You know, and I listen to what Kevin said too. I think it's really important that you do put out something. I think it's more apt to be passed if it's something that includes the whole town and it's not department-wise. Department-wise tends to pit one against the other. And we don't want to do that anymore because nobody's winning. And if we could just do it, you know, I've been living here in Whitman for now almost 45 years. And I lived in Hanson before that, so I've been in both towns. You know, both towns are very important to me, and I think to everybody sitting here, that's why they're here. The kids are actually especially important to me because I teach here. But I think everything is important. People need the police, people need fire. We've all needed everybody. And if we present a united front and present one thing that includes for the town, not for school, you know, we'll know what school needs, we'll know what police need, fire, DPW, what everybody needs. Look at DPW, still waiting on that building. How many years are we waiting on that building for DPW? So, you know, if you put it all as this is what the town needs to grow, this is what the town needs, rather than individual, I think that's really important. I think that's very important for us to do, and I think that's what's important to do here, to decide on what the towns need altogether and present that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just to add to the structure, again, I agree with Frank and Bob, and, you know, I think all departments need a one-year anticipated budget, and we need to designate or identify a timeline. I would also advocate for a 2 to 5 year view, because again, what if we just look at this year, we have to start it this year because this is the group that's working on it. But 2 to 5 year is just as important as looking at 1 year. So again, go through the same process. All departments look out 2 to 5 years. If we have a major capital expense that we anticipate, or police or fire or DPW, we know that now, then again, we're strategically planning this budget. And then, once those two sets of deliverables are in place, then you can look at existing revenue streams and alternative revenue streams. But to Bob's point, you know, we need to know what we need before we start brainstorming about alternative revenue streams.
But short-term, long-term.
Yeah.
And I think the same frustration comes out of, is anybody here from capital improvement?
No. But you're right, the capital improvement matrix.
I think the same frustration comes from them because we've been before both capital improvement committees, and we find that they have the same issue, that the capital improvement matrix may be 2 to 5 years, as you talk about, but it never gets funded, any of it, except piecemeal. So they have that same frustration, because we've been before both of them, and they say, it's difficult because a certain part of the budget, it's been so tight, never gets really put aside for doing those capital improvements. So you have crumbling, failing stuff that goes on. It's really nobody's fault, but there needs to be a better system in place for all of us.
Yes, I get it.
Every department, for every single thing that goes on in both of these towns. And it'll help, and that's kind of what I'm hoping we can all support each other with at some point, and brainstorm. You know, I mean, that's what this group is about.
So we need to get together as a school committee and figure out exactly what we want in the next year, and not just level service funding. I think it's about high time we start adding back to what we offer.
Yes, we're gonna have to bring that, just like every other department, but I completely agree with what that was saying, what Frank was saying, what Chris and his wife were saying. Sean?
Cheryl.
I agree with the planning. I think having a 1-year, 3-year, 5-year strategic planning for all departments, I think moving that really would make it exceptional. I think the town of Whitman does things very well. To move into like the exceptional category would be helpful. But on the flip side of the coin, I think if we're going to ask people to sacrifice, it's very important that we demonstrate how we'll sacrifice in all departments. So really up in the level of transparency, so that people are going to say, I am going to support this initiative, or that strategic plan really makes sense. And by the way, it's obvious where they're spending their money and how they're sacrificing. I think would, be really helpful for somebody to make that goal. As opposed to, it's really good to know where the money's going, but if you don't know how the money's being spent to really, again, I think everybody does a good job. I think we can move into the exceptional category so that people can be thorough, say, geez, they are really sacrificing, and it does make sense. Just eliminate all doubt.
Anyone else?
Bob, I think the only thing I would add is, so I like the direction we're going, and I think there needs to be a real clarity. Somebody said it earlier, what do we want these towns to represent? These towns that we live in, what do we want them to be? So if that's the path we're going down, if we're gonna look at this cohesive, this is what we need, then there also needs to be a clarity of, if we don't get that, this is what it means. So we're either gonna be the town that we want, and these are the things that we need to get there, or if we don't, there's gonna be a shared challenge or sacrifice across all of these departments as to what that means. I think it's really important for folks to understand, because it's gonna be hard. Nobody wants to spend the money. So if we're gonna ask them to spend the money, because this is what we need, then we also need to be very clear of, if it doesn't happen, this is gonna be the effect. And it's not gonna be, we're pitting fire against police versus highway versus schools. We're all gonna have to sacrifice accordingly. And then the real questions of voters will be, is this the town you wanna live in, or the towns you wanna live in? So I just hope we can highlight both sides of that equation.
Yeah, it's gotta be more long-term than short-term.
Long-term.
You don't wanna keep coming back every 3 to 5 years saying, oh, by the
I
way,
got somebody from you.
these are these capital projects we wanna do next. We should just be looking at that, trying to figure it out to say, maybe revenue has to come up to hit this height, and over the next 5, 6 years, that money will be spent towards this, whatever we have to do to make both towns work right.
Marshall?
Just moving forward, I know the schedule's tough, but I think we do need to have some representatives from fire, police, DPW here, because as Kevin and Chris brought up, like, when we go forward, it's gonna be comprehensive. It can't be the school or something, the police, it has to be comprehensive, all departments in town. If we go for an override, it has to be, this is going to schools, this is going to fire, this is going to police, because that's the only way things are going to get done, so I know we need to reach out to Chief Brennan, Chief Hinton, someone needs to be here, so that we're all on the same page.
Well, this is a fabulous start we have going here. It really is. I'm excited that we have this many people. Fred?
I just wanted to add, I don't think that we can, when we look long-term, I think what we need to do is separate operating from capital, though. On the long term, what our capital needs may be, but as far as the operating, people don't want to hear us coming back next year or the year after, We're going to lay out the plan, show our needs, and do it once.
Mr. Chairman, if I could just throw out a suggestion. The town of Pembroke, which I also represent, well, that's now 2 years ago, I believe, went through something similar and did an operational override, which was successful. So it might be worth some folks here kind of reaching out to their, I'm sure you probably already have, but their counterparts over in Pembroke, just to kind of get their input on that process and how that went, what the pitfalls might have been and so forth.
Cheryl?
To piggyback on what Josh was saying, I think a big part of why we did a lot of extensive research on that particular override and the one in Rockland as well. They were both so successful and they saw a lot of improvements in those towns. And the biggest thing we kept seeing was, to Marcia's point, was everybody who was backing it. The fire chief, the police chief, we saw all those little flyers that went home to people's houses. Josh, we saw your name right on it. Everybody
You
that
saw
was
a flyer
supportive.
with the chairman of the Republican Town Committee, the Democratic Town Committee, and me. People you never see agreeing on things, all on the same flyer, yeah.
And when you could see that the whole town was clearly behind it, it obviously wasn't an us versus them mentality. I certainly felt last year it felt very strongly in us versus them mentality, even going through the voter rolls who actually ended up voting and different people in leadership positions in our towns who didn't even vote. It was a really hard thing and it got really ugly. And I think they were so successful because clearly all of their departments were on board. And I think it's going to be important to look at the towns around us and see what they have that we don't have. Because I know personally I've done tons of research on what the schools have that we don't have, and I could go on and on about it. But I bet our fire and police and DPW could give the same exact information of what maybe that I don't know, but I would love to be informed on that. So I think we really need to let people know. I mean, let's face it, we're not paying enough in taxes. We all know that. Like, that's the bottom line. They're very low for the area. No one wants to pay more, but we're clearly not paying our fair share. But I think it would be great if we could really highlight what towns around us have and are doing that we consider similar to us. And if we could do that for all the departments, maybe more people would be on board and we wouldn't hear so many things like, oh, the school doesn't need this or that's frivolous. Maybe we would have less of that if we could wrap our brain around what everybody has what all the departments want that we don't have, and not just the schools.
Right.
It all comes back to the original reason I asked for this group meeting. The difference between Rockland and Pembroke and us is we're a region. We don't have a single town challenge. We have 3 collective governments that have to come together and present one cohesive plan. It means Whitman-Hanson are going to have to join at the hip in ways we haven't done before. And it means the school district is going to have to come into that piece as well. And transparency is a really important part of that, Sean. There's so much misconception about budgets out there right now. Just wild things I hear from time to time. And I mean, all the information is out there. You can't walk into a town meeting in Whitman and say we're not transparent. We vote every line. Every salary is a separate vote. How much more transparent can you get? I mean, we spell out the expenditures, but what we need to do is we need to get people to understand what that means. And what that means in terms of what are we doing as a community? How are we investing our resources? Because if we're not educating our children, then we failed at the most basic level. And that's what this is all about. Making sure that people understand it, making sure that people can come to grips with the needs that exist and accept that we have to come up with a way to fund them. And there are very limited options. You know, Rockland has a terrific commercial tax base. They also have a split rate. Pembroke has a decent commercial tax base. Our tax base, our commercial tax base, is 8% of our taxable property right now. I mean, people ask me about a shift in tax rates, and I laugh at them. Every dime will cost $10. So we have to recognize the reality of where we are and deal with that and come up with ways to make it work. Because we're not going to change overnight, we're not going to change in 5 years. We have predictable expenses, we have predictable capital needs, and frankly, I can't speak for Hanson, but I can tell you, we've put off a ton of capital things that we should be doing because of our limited revenue. DPW is a great example. In 2007, I asked the Board of Selectmen to form a committee to study our facilities. We came back with a plan or with an analysis, and to put that analysis into work would have required $25 million. So we said, okay, let's pick the one that's most important. And that's the process we've used on and on. Most of our capital funding comes from the free cash that we generate by virtue of money that isn't spent, growth that we didn't anticipate, and collection on accounts that are in tax title. That's where the vast majority of free cash comes from. And then we use that to pay a bond. So when we look at that, and I can't look at that in a negative way. We committed to that. We knew that. When we met as a town meeting and voted to build the police station and repair the town hall and the fire station, we said, this is going to be paid for out of returned revenues. We're going to use our free cash to fund this bond, because without it, it wouldn't work. And we have been able to do that. And we've had the good fortune of having additional commercial revenue that we hadn't anticipated. I'm hoping to see some of that continue, but it may not. But the fact of the matter is, every year, we live with Prop 2.5. And we look at our revenue and we say, okay, we can add 2.5% to what we taxed last year, and we can add new growth. But it may not be enough. So the option, the elephant in the room here, is we need to raise the levy limit to fund everything we need to fund. Either that, or we need to do wholesale closings on the other side of the ledger. Those are the options. So we all have to work together to come up with a way to keep our towns intact and fund what we need for our schools.
Anyone else?
Bob?
Yes.
Well, Bob. The funding of the towns is one thing, but I think this committee should maybe have subcommittees to look at the actual costs of a school or the departments and bring it back here from all the departments in both town of Whitman-Hanson. Then you got a known factor, what it's gonna cost if you want this, okay? How are we gonna do that? Now, being in business is probably a little different from being in a school. But before I can move, I gotta have know where that funds are coming so I can go forward. And you sure know that yourself, okay? So I think this committee needs the budgets from the towns and the members of the towns here divide up, understand what you're gonna put together, have a regular report, and how you're gonna finance it, one way or the other. You shouldn't have any department fighting one another, get the police in the fire to get them done, and the heck with the school. I know how that works. So I think you take the whole package, very like Frank says, okay? You gotta do it now. You can't do it in January or February. You're out of your mind, okay? And I've been there, okay? That's what I would suggest to the committee, to take it all from the town of Whitman-Hanson and put it on the table, put it up in the subcommittee, and let them hammer that out, and you can have an income where the funds are coming from, and get it done. Just talking funding, you don't know what we don't know what we're gonna fund, do we? Nothing. I wanna know what the fund is, and then we'll work out a way we're gonna pay for it. You can't count on the state, period.
Well, I think all those numbers are readily available, Mike, through the Finance Committee. I mean,
Huh?
you have,
Yeah, I mean, it just, to one of the other gentleman's comments in terms of operating versus capital, and the comments with the capital matrix. In terms of the operating budget, I mean, the budget that's in place were to support the needs for this next fiscal year. Of those expenses, I would tell you that the things that are moving targets, I think, are salaries and medical health. I think those are the two numbers that are going to be the biggest influence on what a specific department's change is going to be from year to year, at least in terms of operations. So from what does police need? From an operational perspective, it's what's in the fiscal 18 budget. The question here, and where I feel I need to say that we need to be a little cautious in terms of, I don't think it's going to be up to us as a committee to say to police, you don't need that, or you do need this, or you can't have that. That's not our place to be. And ultimately, that's what is settled on town floor as you go line by line through an operating budget. I think that the bigger number that has more of an impact probably centers more on the capital side, because at least, from a free cash spend, it's if we are this broke and I have to replace this, was it on the capital improvement? Did it go through capital improvement? But you get these things where it may be $200,000 for this that might have come out of free cash, that might have been able to be allocated for something else, school-related, another department, whatever the case may be. And that gets into that juggling act of, we had 14 things on the improvement and we were able to fund 4 of them. So in terms of the wants versus needs, I think more of that is how free cash gets spent on capital improvement than from the operating perspective.
Can I ask a question though?
Yeah.
Would anybody sit here and say that 7th from the bottom, that our operating budget is meeting our needs? Our needs are being 7th from the bottom in school funding and per pupil funding? I mean, I would stand here and say, our current operating budget does not meet our financial needs.
Well,
I guess that's the
look,
message that we need to
And look, I hear what you're saying, but again, from being cautious, what I hope is in an attempt to be transparent and get that message across, a couple of things. One, when you're at town meeting and making some of these voting decisions, you need more than 130 people in a town of 10,000 to show up. Secondly, the message needs to be clear that this is trying to work across the board, and that everybody is in on this, because this is one budget. This isn't school's budget, this isn't police's, and you can't touch and nobody talk to each other. But if it's that the school has a shortfall, in this case, we came to this with a $2.2 million shortfall, and the message then becomes, if we can't pass that override, then we're threatening police because you're gonna lose 5 cops, or we're threatening fire that you're gonna lose people. That message, the way you were talking, and I appreciate the passion of it, but that's kind of the message I was hearing.
But the police haven't lost those people because back in the day, the towns, through the state, because of regionalization, got more money, right? And since that's been cut, and since the state has said, you as towns need to pay more, the only system that really has taken a hard hit is the school system, right? And so how do you change that message? How do you say to the residents?
Part of that too, though, is you, like, at least in terms of Hanson, police is a $1.9 million, $2 million budget. This is when you have your taxes.
I get it.
It's a numbers game. It's how do you make this work for everybody involved?
Something you may want to consider, though, is if you're proactively starting the strategic planning process, there's also the feedback you're getting from the community during that process. So it doesn't have to be just at town meeting, your vote is deciding what to pay for.
No, and that's why we're meeting now.
Right.
We don't want to go into
And I
that.
guess
That's what we're interested in
we
doing.
need to be careful about the language, because the operating budgets do not meet the town's needs today, right? And you said, From an operating standpoint, the budget worked for this year. It didn't really work for this year. It didn't work for this year. I mean, walk through the schools, see what we're missing, see what we've cut, see the adjustment counselors we don't have. Spend some time in the classroom and understand that these kids are much different than the kids of 10, 15 years ago. Understand that last year's graduating class, if we just kept the same ratios, would have had millions of dollars more in the budget than we have today. So slowly over time, and that's ratios, right? So that takes into account declining enrollment. We would have millions more in the budget to keep those same ratios. Our
Can
operating
you
budget
back
has
that
not-
up and explain that a little bit more?
Sure. So if you look at the ratios of teachers and staff to students,
Yep.
if the kids who were graduating last year, if we applied those same ratios to our kids today in elementary school, there would be millions more in the budget just to maintain those ratios.
I think it was 35, we would have 35 more staff members. I think how we looked at it was when those kids started in first grade, what was the ratios? So not, of course, there's declining enrollment. And then what was that ratio when they graduated? Because what we were trying to show is those parents were not understanding that the kids behind them were getting left behind because their kids were doing okay and they were making out. So if we had those same ratios, we would have had right off the bat, I think it was 35 more staff members. Our daughter happened to be in one of those, poor woman who had 28 kids in her class. Those kids didn't have those things 12 years ago. So when we're hearing a lot about the population decline, which it certainly has been, those ratios went down much greater. And then when you turn that into dollars, that's where we, right off the bat, we're missing a few $1 million right off the bat. And I think it's hard to explain those because the school budget itself is so enormous to the whole town. I mean, it's a huge dollar amount, of course it is. And a 1%, teacher raise or something is a huge number for the towns to absorb. What we were hoping that we can get all the Board of Selectmen and the finance committees and all the departments on board to recognize that 7th from the bottom, and really it'll probably be 5th from the bottom when the newest ones come out, isn't okay. And that when we are looking at all of the towns around us, they are moving way further and we are just getting left in the dust. I mean, kindergarten is my one little pet project. It's now at 85% of the state at full day K starting in September with only 15% not offering it. And I know not everyone agrees with full day K, but wow, we are not on the same track that the rest of the state is going. That's one small little piece I've been doing all kinds of research on. What's the kids have in elementary for computer science and library and social workers and middle school, foreign language, and all the 31 towns around us. I'm trying to pull all this data together to show people really what we're missing and hopefully validate maybe some of it we used to have, some of it we don't have, never had, but we haven't been going in the right direction. So I think like what Chris is trying to say is the operating budget worked, but it didn't really work because it's not improving anything for our kids that are there today. They're not gonna see any improvements next year. So all the things that they're missing, they're still gonna keep missing. That's the message I would love to have the towns behind and the leaders in the town to say, this is not right. We believe greater in education. And then at the same time, if there are things we're missing in our other departments, yeah, we need to be looking at all of that. But I'm just not sure if everybody is understanding the situation. I think is more grave than people really want to admit when you start digging into the details of how much these kids are missing. It's really hard. Sometimes I say, I wish I never knew, and I could blissfully go through the day and think everything was fine, like most of my, most people do, but.
But it's not the same system that it was. It's drastically not the same system.
Yeah.
And I think if your kids graduated or, already, it's drastically different, It's not the same school system that I chose to move to this town for. It's gone. I mean, it's gone, and it's probably too late for my daughter. I mean, I've said openly, I've got to look at private school for her. There are too many programs that are missing at the middle school level. I can't, and I hate to say that, I am the product of a public school education. I grew up in a town where my father was on the school committee for 15 years. I get it. That ship has sailed. I'm hoping maybe for my son that we can save something. But if something doesn't change, no way. I mean, no way, because it's only going to get worse. And that's, Go ahead.
Yeah, just to put in context what Cheryl and Chris are saying. 12 years ago, think back to 2005, Whitman-Hanson got a significant amount of its operating budget from the state, and it was not one bit unusual to see the district's budget increase by 4 or 5% annually. So what the comment that they've made, they've done it in a little different way, but it's the same thing. Financially, if that trajectory had stayed the same from 2005 to the present, the Whitman-Hanson operating budget would be significantly greater than it is. We were very close to the state average in per pupil expenditures. If today we were at the average in per pupil expenditures, our budget would be over $60 million. And right now it's $48 million, and that's looking at the number of students. So that's even taking into account declining enrollment. So you have to try and figure out what has happened over time and why you're not seeing the same services. I often remind people when I came to Whitman-Hanson, and it was a long time ago, 1994, we offered French, Latin, and Spanish to every single student in the middle schools. Right now, we have one Spanish teacher in each middle school. That just puts it in context. We had a band teacher who left. So if you want to look at when the tide began to turn, it was around 2007, which is exactly what we talked about earlier with target share and this understanding that Whitman-Hanson was too dependent on state aid. Couple that with the recession, and what we've seen is an average increase in the last 5-6 years is about 1% in the budget, and we actually have had a couple years where the budget was less than it was the year before. I think we've done a good job of getting a lot out of a dollar, and sometimes that puts us in a tough position because people say, well, look at what they're doing. What is optimistic, however, is this year's budget, 2017, that ends in a couple of weeks, was up over 3% from the year before. This year's budget's up over 3%. So I don't think you're going to see Whitman-Hanson decline in its ranking in per pupil expenditure. You're going to see it go up. I don't think when we see the data that's going to reflect, every time you look at DESE data, the Department of Ed data, it's a year old. So I don't think we're going back, but I don't think we're getting anywhere close to the state average. So just to put in context what you were saying, you're exactly right. It's just another way of looking at it. If we had continued to grow at that rate, we'd have a much different school
And
system.
I don't think anybody is asking for the state average. Nobody's asking that
Be
we come
nice.
close to that state average. Maybe you guys are, but right at this point,
Realistic.
I think as responsible taxpayers and understanding how things work, nobody is asking for that. I guess, what I would say is it can't be the schools and the town have a problem. It needs to be every department has a problem. It needs to be the towns have a problem, right? It's not the schools have a problem, the towns have a problem because they need to fund education. And so I think the point that was made earlier is how do we get the leaders of those boards that set policy and give direction, right? The selectmen in both towns. When they set policy with their finance committees, when they go to Frank and say, Frank, this is what we want you to focus on, how do we start to build that message that something needs to be done? We have a revenue problem. It's a shared problem. It's not an us versus them. Listen, whatever comes out of it, comes out of it. We're not going to get $6 million from each town. I think we all understand that. But I think when you look at what we spend in taxes compared to our demographics and compared to the towns around us, we don't pay enough. We need to figure out how we successfully get that message so that we can get to a point where we can raise enough revenue to run the towns the way that they're supposed to be run. I mean, it's that simple. It's that simple. We can talk about how do the schools spend their money? Could you spend it better somewhere else? Sure, it's a $48 million budget. I deal with budgets every day. There are things that I would do differently than you do. But if you have a reason for it, then me as a taxpayer, I need to come here. I need to understand how you spend that money. I need to understand the reason why. And if I still have a problem with it, then I need to go to the polls and I need to direct my school committee members to spend it differently. But right now, we've elected a school committee who picks their superintendent, who then decides how we're gonna spend the money. The one thing is, seventh from the bottom is not, it's not enough. It's not enough. And anything that we can argue about doesn't move the needle. And how do we get behind that message? How do we successfully sell that we don't have enough revenue in both towns to run the towns the way they're supposed to be run?
I think there's two things you've said, Chris, and I've got a question right behind you, and she's being awful patient. You said two important things, the polls and town meeting. The people come and they're the ones who direct us on how they're gonna spend their money by voting. Now the question is, how do we get the message better to them? Because they've selectively said, I'm pretty sure in Hanson, a year or two ago, the override failed like 3-1. So, I mean, those people come out, and I heard them loud and clear, they said, no way, by like 3-1. So, I mean, there was not even a question about it. So the question is, how do we get more of them out? But I think that should be part of our charge with this committee. I was reading the
We have a persuasion issue.
I don't think it's cautious, I think it's neglectful when we're seventh from the bottom and when our fire department has the same numbers that they had, 30 years ago, I think you said. I don't know what the numbers are for police, but I'm sure they've got scary, staggering statistics too. I think to say the budget is being cautious is lipstick on a pig. It's neglectful, it's scary, it can't stay this way. And I think if we're gonna get people together, we can't be making it look rosy and saying all these great things that we need to be serious, we need to show how grave it is, like you said, Cheryl, and not try to make it look better than it is. We can't be twisting it and putting nice words on it.
Right. 2.5 works if the town has new growth. When the towns don't have new growth for years and years and years, 2.5 doesn't work. You gotta override it at some point. I mean, look at all the towns around us. They've done it at some point. They've somehow successfully run a campaign.
Fred, one more, and we said an hour, and we're facing an hour and 23 minutes, so I think we need to task ourselves to what we're gonna do, but go ahead.
I'll be real brief. I don't think it's because of lack of effort. 2 years ago, we did put out a student success budget, and you folks, a lot of you in this audience, worked very, very hard to put that over the top. It failed. And with the leaderships from the towns, both chairmen of the boards of selectmen are here.
Yep.
We have members of the finance committee. We have our town administrator from Whitman. Let's forget the past. We know we have a problem. Okay, let's look at the future. We know we need to do better. And let's figure out a way that we can do better. That's what we need to be doing right now.
That's exactly what we're here for. Figure out a way to do better. But all of this is wonderful language to come out. It gets everybody's feelings, and it gives you a possible starting point. The question is, where do we go from tonight? So I think Wilbur brings up a good point. We'll try to get some statistics from the towns, from the finance committees. It's all public record, it's all public knowledge. I mean, it's kind of like when you get, I don't believe it's called the town report. I just got one in Hanson. It lists every single thing, and people say, in fact, I had somebody come up to me in Shaw's and say, I'm gonna fire you. And I said, please, I'm okay. And they said, well, we're paying you this huge salary, and I happen to have the book. And I went, where is my name in here? And it's just because of what you said, Frank. It's kind of like sometimes I wonder, I'm reading your iPad, and all of a sudden I look and I go, where did that information come from? The meeting was last night, and we surely said this. And it's almost like maybe somebody's fingers hit the wrong buttons and they didn't have a clue. So I think that's what this committee, what we're trying to do, what you would put forth, why Kyle's here, why Jim McGann's here, why Mike's here from Finance Committee, and why every other concerned citizen's here, everybody on the school committee and all the people in the gallery. That's what we're all trying to do. We want to get together, see if we can kick this around, see if we can help our leaders to get more out of what we're getting, get the citizens involved, so more people come, and Chris, you hit it right on the head. We need more people to come and vote.
Yep.
You know, you've got, I think, 10,000 registered voters in Whitman, Frank? Am I close?
Yep.
And I think there's 6,000 or 7,000 in Hanson. So there's 17,000 voters. I think at the last election, Whitman had 1,000 people registered, or 1,200 or something, and I don't think Whitman had many more. Out of 17,000,
Last
we had,
town meeting, we had 151 voters to open the meeting.
I think we had 130
something.
130, yeah. We need more people, so if this gets the message out, because somebody's talking, and we get some more people, and then they come to the meetings, and anybody that's watching, please come. You can see it's an open meeting forum. Everybody talks. Say what you ask.
I think the way to start this, since Christine has all this free time, is I'd like to get together with Christine and with Michael and Hanson and start spreading some numbers together. Just the three of us, we work on the budgets all the time. We have the numbers there. Create a document that says, here's what we've got. Then let's bring a group together, the Finance Committee, Selectmen, and school committee members, and look at it. But at the same time, we each need to be working on our projections. You know, towns are not very good at projecting because they rely on inertia. You know, Sean and I have had discussions about 5-year plans. I can do that tomorrow. I can take a calculator, add 2.5, 2.5, 2.5, 2.5, and 2.5. And I can estimate 200,000 for growth over 5 years, and there's my revenue. But that's not gonna cut it. And then I have to look at the expenditures, and, you know, we're a little unique in Whitman because of the ambulance fund. We get 800,000 a year in revenue from transporting people to hospitals and other places. That's a captured fund. Its use is limited to fire and capital expenditures for fire. We have, over the last couple of years, pushed more of our salary expenses into that fund. But that's one piece of it. That's 1/30 of our revenue on our recap sheet. What we have to do is look at all of our expenditures, look at all of the expenditures that are going to be needed to make Whitman-Hanson run, combine those, allocate them by population, and then figure out what it's going to take to fund it. It's a simple task. It's just a lot of work. And we got to get it passed. Well, you know, Whitman passed an override for fire this year. I was shocked. I never expected that would pass. It was a small number, 310,000, and we're adding, for the first time in over 50 years, 4 firefighters to the town. Certainly, the case was made for the need, no question in my mind. But that same case needs to be made for what we're doing here.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming. It was interesting. I'm hoping it was somewhat educational for some of the people that were watching. And I know I heard a lot of things that needed to be said, so we should set a date for the next meeting, and I appreciate it's 90-some-odd degrees out. I'm glad that everybody came out today. It was
Nice in here,
probably
though.
the warmest day. I was sweating it,
Well,
literally.
90 in here, you wouldn't have had any.
How about,
You want to do September 11th? It gives people the summer to pull this together.
do you want to lay off for the summer and hit the beginning of September? Does that sound?
If, as a large group, you can do that, but we need to start working.
But that would be reporting out based on conversations that you talked about. I think you need to, we need to come to that meeting
Working
over the summer to
over
get
the
those
summer.
numbers.
Let
Yes.
me quantify that further.
Yeah, that can't be a whole new,
Hopefully, looking at vacations and other things, by mid-August, we should have enough numbers
if you did
together
the
to
11th.
start
You need to do
putting an action
mid-August.
plan together.
You should, because that's a check-in point.
Yep.
That way, if something's not right, you got time to
Exactly.
get something by September.
Yeah, that'll give us way more time if we do it right in
It's
September.
realistic, too.
How's,
Be the 11th?
September 11th? Is that a holiday?
No, the 4th is Labor Day. It would be a Monday, and then we have school committee Wednesday, so it's the same as
Might
this.
even have an idea of enrollment projection.
Well, that's, yeah, we can work on that.
Everybody okay?
August or September?
You're saying August, but
Dude, August, you're going to have trouble with attendance. I just think you are. I've seen it. Or
Yeah, we
do
have
the end
school-
of August if you want to, but I wouldn't do it. People will be away, and we're not going to get this same group again. If you did 21st of August, that might work.
21st?
But see, you're not going to be here, so that's September. September's realistic,
As long as the smaller subject.
but I
Yeah,
think
as
we have
long
to
as they're
come
working.
prepared with information.
Well, we have an email list from this meeting.
Yes.
Let's put that together as a distribution list, and when Christine and I and Mike start compiling some of those numbers and put them together, we'll distribute
We'll
it.
get a better idea.
We can get
The more
information out.
we get out sooner, the better we're all gonna be.
Yeah, so people will come
If you wanna,
prepared.
if you wanna wait until mid-August to focus on a date, that would be fine too. We can send out a,
Yeah, we'll see where we're at as a
what
working
we're doing.
document, and I'll work
Yeah.
with you on that.
Yeah.
Everybody good with it?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you
If
so
you
much.
haven't signed this,
Yeah, we're missing a couple
if
people, I
anybody
know.
hasn't, please come up so we can keep you
Yeah, we have
totally
a couple-
abreast of what's going
Couple
on.
new folks
Thank
came
you
in we
again.
didn't get.